Hi, I'm Jay Link, President of Stewardship Ministries. For many years, I've been actively promoting the idea of generous giving. I've written books and articles about it, I've taught on it, and I've helped affluent families to do it. To say the least, generosity for me is both a calling and a passion. But quite recently, the Lord has shown me through a sequence of unrelated events that I still have a lot to learn about what it means to be generous. Let me tell you the stories. Recently on Sunday morning at the end of our worship time, the worship minister announced that we were about to watch an extraordinary video about a couple in our church. As the video rolls, I'm surprised. I know the husband, BJ, because I played basketball with him at the church for the past few years. I liked him from the very first time we played ball together. BJ's a young man in his late 20s, has a successful money management practice, and is an extremely talented athlete. Since I knew one of the main characters in the video, I proudly nudged my wife and I said, "I know him." My excitement, however, turned to embarrassment as he and his wife shared their story. BJ's wife had a high school friend who was very ill and in need of a kidney transplant. Both of them immediately said to themselves, maybe we could give her one of our kidneys. Well, it seemed reasonable to me that BJ's wife might want to give her good friend one of her kidneys. But as it turned out, BJ's kidney was the perfect match. So without hesitation, he donated one of his kidneys to his wife's high school friend. They shared that it just seemed like the right thing to do. BJ had an extra kidney, and this girl had none. I was stunned. I wouldn't give one of my kidneys to one of my wife's friends. I wouldn't even consider it. Of course, I would give one to my wife or to one of my children if they needed it, but to one of my wife's friends? Don't get me wrong, I'm all about giving of my time and talent and treasures, but giving my torso, my body parts? That was a level of giving that entirely surpassed my current concept of generosity. Just a few days later, I was ready to board a plane to return home from a business trip. I was first in line and was looking forward to getting comfortable in my first class seat and then just zoning out on the flight home. I often get upgraded for free. Just prior to our boarding, a very heavy crippled man had been escorted down the jetway in his wheelchair to board the plane. So I waited patiently for the call for first class to board. However, just as they began to announce first class boarding, another guy cuts right in front of me and hands the attendant his boarding pass. His rude manner and obvious arrogant attitude really irritated me. As I got to the bottom of the jetway, 4 airline staff were having difficulty getting the heavy crippled man out of his wheelchair and into the airline wheelchair needed to get him on the plane. This delay was causing a backup in the jetway. No one was able to board because they were right in front of the plane door. So here I am standing and stewing over this rude guy who cut in front of me while I was waiting to get into the plane. I stood there a little impatiently waiting and watching the airline employees working futilely to get this crippled man into the airline wheelchair. And then the bomb fell. This guy who cut in front of me calls out to the flight crew, "Hey, let me help you." So he drops his bags and hurries over to them and helps get the man into the plane wheelchair. I was so ashamed. I was standing there just like the line cutter was, but the thought never even crossed my mind to offer any help. Of all the people standing there watching this happen, this guy, who I was convinced was so selfish and full of himself, was the one who volunteered to help. Unfortunately, the humiliation wasn't over. When they finally get the man into the wheelchair and through the plane door, Mr. Helpful then says to the airline staff, "Let me go back and get his bag for you." He comes back off the plane and grabs the man's bag, which, by the way, is right at my feet. And he takes it back into him on the plane. Yet another missed opportunity for me to live generously. By this point, I'm feeling very convicted about my lack of generosity. Interestingly enough, it turns out that the line cutter is sitting right across the aisle from me in first class. I told him I appreciated his willingness to help the crippled man. He smiled and said, "It wasn't anything." To him, it wasn't anything. But to me, it proved that of the two of us, I was the one who was selfish and full of myself, not him. But God still wasn't finished rocking my generosity world. As I'm finally relaxing in my first class aisle seat, the passengers in economy start filing past me. I hear a woman immediately behind me ask the soldier who's standing right next to me, "Soldier, what seat are you in?" He says 21B, one of those dreaded middle seats in the back, I thought. She then says to him, "Would you like to sit here?" The soldier hesitated, but the woman insisted that he take her first-class seat and she would go back and sit in his middle economy seat. Humbled again. This is all happening right next to me. Now, know that I deeply appreciate what our military does for us and our country, and for me as one of its citizens. I've even thanked soldiers for their service on many occasions, but the thought of offering this soldier my first-class seat and taking a middle seat in economy on a packed plane was just another indicator of just how limited my generosity really is. I've been mulling these experiences over in my mind for a few weeks now, and I wanted to share with you the main lesson that I think God has taught me through this. The lesson is this: I can be generous in how I give without being generous in how I live. Conversely, I've also learned that a person who lives generously always gives generously. In other words, we may be willing to be extremely generous in giving what we want to give, where we want to give it, but with what we don't want to give, we can actually find ourselves being just as selfish and tight-fisted as the infamous Ebenezer Scrooge. Living generously, not giving generously, needs to be our goal. I've identified 3 characteristics of people who model generous living. Characteristic number 1 is generous living is open-hearted. Those who live generously are open-hearted and are alert to find people who are struggling, hurting, or in pain. They empathize with those who the world has created difficulty, and they enjoy trying to make it better. Characteristic number 2 is generous living is open-minded. The minds of those who live generously are always thinking about creative ways to bless and encourage others in both great and small ways. They are consciously engaged in their world and the lives of those around them, poised to show generosity to anyone wherever the opportunity presents itself. And characteristic number 3, generous living is open-handed. The resources of those who live generously, all of them, time, talent, treasure, and torso, are ready to be gladly given whenever a need or an opportunity is discovered. When it is within their power to respond, they relish the privilege to make a difference and to bless the life of another, friend or stranger. They live out the extreme attitude, what is yours, mine is yours, and you can have it. In these 3 recent experiences, it has been vividly demonstrated to me that the key to living a generous life is easy to understand. It is, however, excruciatingly difficult to live because of what it requires of us, a radical change in our self-assessment. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3, "But with humility of mind, let each of you regard one another as more important than himself." There it is, in just one part of one verse. Regard one another as more important than himself. If we can wholly embrace this radical change in our self-assessment and truly come to believe that others are more important than ourselves, we will be completely transformed into not just people who are giving generously, but more importantly, into people who are living generously, who reflect an open-hearted, an open-minded, and an open-handed life. If we really want to achieve maximum kingdom impact in our lives, may I suggest that we expand our focus not just on giving generously, but more importantly, on living generously.